January 14th, 1944, 02:17 a.m., Feldlazarett 316, 12 kilometers west of Sevastopol, Crimea. The screaming reached Hans Metzger before he even entered the surgery tent, a sound so raw it didn't seem human anymore, more like something fundamental breaking inside the universe itself. He pushed through the canvas flap, and the smell hit him like a physical force, gangrene and frostbite and burned flesh, all competing to see which could make a man vomit faster. The temperature inside was barely above freezing, despite the wood stove burning in the corner, consuming furniture scavenged from destroyed Ukrainian farmhouses, and his breath came out in clouds that mixed with the steam rising from buckets of boiling water used to sterilize instruments that would never be truly clean again. On the table, strapped down with leather restraints salvaged from horse tack, a 19-year-old Gefreiter named Wilhelm Brecht writhed against bonds that cut into his wrist deep enough to draw blood. His left leg, or what remained of it, was a horror of blackened tissue extending halfway up the thigh, the result of frostbite that had gone untreated for 11 days during the retreat from the Kerch Peninsula. The flesh had died and begun to rot while still attached to a living body, and the line between dead tissue and living was creeping higher every hour, a race between amputation and septic death that Metzger had seen play out hundreds of times in the past 2 months. There was no morphine. There hadn't been morphine in 7 months, not since the supply lines through Romania had been cut, and what little medical supplies reached Crimea went to SS units first, regular Wehrmacht last, field hospitals never. There was no ether, no chloroform, no anything that could dull the consciousness or deaden the nerves. There was only vodka, 3 bottles of it, scavenged from a destroyed Soviet supply depot, and leather straps, and 2 orderlies strong enough to hold a man down while Metzger sawed through his bones. "Drink," Metzger ordered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and 20 hours of continuous surgery. He held the vodka bottle to Brecht's lips, and the boy, and he was a boy despite the uniform and the iron cross pinned to his filthy tunic, drank desperately, choking on the alcohol, his eyes wild with terror that knew exactly what was coming. "More," Metzger said, and Brecht drank until he was coughing, until the vodka ran down his chin and mixed with tears and snot and all the fluids of absolute fear. It wouldn't be enough. It was never enough. But it was all they had. Stay with this story, because what you're about to witness will redefine everything you thought you knew about the limits of human endurance. The Eastern Front in 1943 and 1994 had become a meat grinder operating on a scale that made previous wars look like skirmishes between villages. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941, had devolved from a war of movement and encirclement into a grinding war of attrition where men died by the millions, and the strategic objective became simply surviving another winter, another summer, another day. By January 1944, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat along most of the front, pushed back by Soviet offensives that had regained all the territory lost in 1941 and 1942 and were now driving toward pre-war German borders. The Crimean Peninsula, that strategic landmass jutting into the Black Sea, had been cut off from land connection to the rest of German-held territory in November 1943, when Soviet forces pushed through to the Perekop Isthmus. The German 17th Army, approximately 235,000 men consisting of Wehrmacht and Romanian formations, was trapped on the peninsula, supplied only by sea through ports that Soviet submarines and aircraft attacked with increasing frequency. Hitler had ordered the Crimea held at all costs, convinced that its loss would turn Turkey against Germany and bring Soviet bombers within range of Romanian oil fields that fueled the entire German war machine. So the 17th Army stayed, dug in, and waited for the inevitable Soviet offensive that would try to destroy them completely. Feldlazarett 316 was not a hospital in any recognizable sense. It was a collection of tents and repurposed farm buildings clustered around what had once been a Ukrainian collective farm, now transformed into a casualty clearing station that serviced the western defensive sector around Sevastopol. The facility had been designed, on paper written by medical administrators in Berlin who had never seen combat, to handle 40 patients at a time, with a staff of 6 surgeons, 12 nurses, and 30 orderlies. Reality had reduced it to 1 surgeon, Hans Metzger, 4 orderlies who rotated through psychological breakdown faster than Metzger could learn their names. And no nurses at all because the Luftwaffe evacuation flights prioritized ammunition and fuel over medical personnel. The 40-bed capacity was a joke. On a quiet day, they had 200 wounded. On a bad day, which was most days, they had over 300. Men lying in hallways, in supply tents, in the snow outside because there was simply no room left inside. The wounds came in categories that Metzger had learned to recognize on sight. Frostbite, the most common, from men who had fought in temperatures that dropped to -30 Celsius without adequate winter clothing because the quartermasters had assured high command that the war would be over before winter. Gangrene, the inevitable follow-up to frostbite, when tissue died and infection set in, and the only treatment was amputation before the poison spread to the blood. Shrapnel wounds from Soviet artillery, jagged metal fragments that tore through flesh and shattered bones in ways that made reconstruction impossible. Burns from destroyed tanks, men who had escaped burning vehicles with their skin melting off like candle wax. Gunshot wounds, surprisingly less common than the others, but often more immediately fatal. Bullets that tumbled through soft tissue and created wound channels the size of fists. The numbers were impossible. Metzger had tried to keep count in the first month, recording each surgery in a logbook with Germanic precision, patient name, rank, unit, type of procedure, outcome. But the numbers became meaningless when they grew too large to comprehend, when every day brought 70, 80, 90 amputations. When the pile of severed limbs behind the surgery tent grew so large, it had to be burned twice daily to prevent disease. When the smoke from burning human flesh became a permanent fixture of the landscape that other units used as a navigation landmark. By March 1944, Metzger had stopped writing names. He recorded only procedures and outcomes, tally marks in a ledger that would eventually be recovered by Soviet forces and studied by military historians who would struggle to believe what the numbers represented. Metzger was 41 years old for frontline service, but young for a surgeon with his experience. He had trained at Heidelberg before the war, studying under Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch, the pioneering thoracic surgeon who had revolutionized chest surgery in World War I. Metzger had been good, gifted even, with hands that were steady and a mind that could visualize anatomy in 3 dimensions. He had planned a career in academic medicine, teaching and research, comfortable university positions where the most stressful decision would be which journal to publish in. The war had consumed those plans like it consumed everything else. Conscripted in 1940, assigned to Wehrmacht medical services, sent first to France where the casualties were light and the facilities were excellent, then to the Eastern Front in 1942 where he learned what war really meant. By the time he was posted to Feldlazarett 316 in November 1943, he had already performed over 3,000 amputations. That number would seem quaint by the time Soviet forces captured him 14 months later. The procedure for amputating a limb without anesthesia was something Metzger had been forced to develop through trial and terrible error. Medical school had taught him the surgical technique, how to cut through muscle in layers, how to ligate blood vessels to prevent hemorrhage, how to saw through bone at an angle that would leave a stump suitable for prosthetic fitting, how to preserve flaps of skin and muscle to cover the wound. But medical school had assumed anesthesia, a patient rendered unconscious and insensate, muscles relaxed, body still. A conscious patient, paralyzed by terror and pain, required completely different protocols. The leather straps were essential, 3 across the chest, 2 on the good leg, 2 on each arm, all pulled tight enough to restrict movement, but not so tight they cut off circulation. The restraints had to be checked constantly because men in agony develop strength they shouldn't possess, tearing through bonds that should hold them, injuring themselves further in desperate attempts to escape pain that had no escape. The orderlies, usually 4 of them, positioned at strategic points to add their body weight when restraints weren't enough. 1 at the patient's head, holding the skull immobile and watching for signs of shock that could kill faster than the injury itself. 2 at the torso, pinning shoulders when bucking became violent. 1 at the limb being amputated, holding it steady so Metzger's saw would cut bone cleanly instead of splintering it. The vodka helped, but only marginally. Alcohol dulled consciousness and provided temporary amnesia for some patients, but it did nothing for pain itself. Men still screamed. They screamed so loudly and for so long that the field hospital earned a reputation across the entire defensive sector. Other units requested, officially through command channels, that Feldlazarett 316 be relocated further from the front lines because the screaming was destroying morale, because men in the trenches could hear it for kilometers and understood exactly what awaited them if they were wounded. The requests were denied because there was nowhere to relocate to. The entire Crimean Peninsula was within artillery range. And besides, moving a field hospital required transportation assets that didn't exist. The amputation itself, once restraints were secured and vodka administered, followed a procedure Metzger had refined to minimize time because time was the only variable he could control. Locate the line of demarcation where dead tissue transitioned to living. Mark the cutting line 5 centimeters above that, ensuring complete removal of all compromised tissue. Apply a tourniquet above the cutting line, tightened until blood flow stopped completely, buying precious minutes before hemorrhage could become fatal. Make the first incision through skin, a circular cut around the circumference of the limb, deep enough to expose the underlying fascia. Retract the skin upward, creating a cuff that would later cover the stump. The muscles came next, cut in layers, each major muscle group severed individually to allow controlled retraction. This was where blood loss became critical, where major arteries had to be identified, clamped, and ligated with catgut sutures before they could hemorrhage. Metzger's hands worked with automatic precision, fingers identifying arteries by touch alone in wounds too bloody to see clearly, clamping them with hemostats, tying them off with sutures that would dissolve over weeks, moving to the next one. The bone was the final barrier. Periosteum stripped back to expose bare bone, white and hard and requiring the saw, a surgical saw with teeth fine enough to cut cleanly, but coarse enough to work quickly. This was where patients who had endured everything else finally broke, because bone conducted vibration directly to nerve endings in ways soft tissue didn't, because the sound of steel teeth cutting through your own skeleton was something human psychology wasn't designed to process. Metzger sawed with firm, even strokes, 40 years of surgical training focused on this single barbaric act. The bone separated, the limb came free, handed off to an orderly who carried it outside to add to the pile. The stump remained, muscles retracted, blood vessels tied off, bone cut at a slight angle to prevent pressure points. The skin cuff was pulled down over everything, stretched to cover the wound, sutured shut with stitches that would hold if the patient survived, would tear open if infection set in. A pressure bandage wrapped tight, and the amputation was complete. From first incision to final bandage, 7 to 9 minutes for a leg, 5 to 7 for an arm, 3 to 4 for extremities below the elbow or knee. These times represented the bare minimum, achieved only when everything went perfectly, when anatomy was normal, when blood vessels were where they were supposed to be, when bone was healthy enough to cut cleanly. Complications added time. Time cost lives, both the patient currently on the table and the dozens waiting their turn. Wilhelm Brecht screamed for 4 minutes straight before his body's natural defense mechanisms shut down his consciousness, pain overload triggering a blackout that was merciful if temporary. His left leg came off mid-thigh, the gangrenous tissue extending high enough that Metzger had to cut through the thick femur bone, the hardest single bone to amputate. 8 minutes from first cut to final stitch. Brecht would likely survive. The amputation had been clean, no major complications, blood loss minimal. He would wake up in the recovery tent, if it could be called that, discover he had one leg, and begin the psychological process of integrating that reality. Or he would develop sepsis from wound contamination and die screaming 3 days later. The survival rate, which Metzger tracked obsessively because it was the only measure of success available, was 71%. 71% of his amputees survived longer than 2 weeks post-surgery. In a field hospital without antibiotics, without proper sterilization, without anesthesia or adequate staff, that number was astonishing. It was also cold comfort when you saw the 29% who didn't survive, who died from shock on the table, or hemorrhage immediately after, or infection that turned their stumps black and killed them slowly while nothing could be done except administer vodka and watch them go. Next, Metzger said, his voice flat and mechanical. An orderly, Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, a 23-year-old who had been transferred to medical service after losing 3 fingers to frostbite and was now losing his mind to what he witnessed daily, dragged Brecht off the table and signaled for the next patient to be brought in. They came. They always came. The stretcher bearers carried them in a steady stream from the receiving tent, where a medical clerk performed initial triage, sorting incoming casualties into categories. Immediate surgical, those who needed amputation or other intervention within hours. Delayed surgical, those who could wait a day. Minimal care, walking wounded who needed bandages and antiseptic but no surgery. And expectant, those too badly injured to save with available resources. Morphine cases, except there was no morphine. So they were given vodka and left in a separate tent to die as comfortably as possible, which wasn't comfortable at all. February brought the first indications that the situation was deteriorating beyond even the nightmare levels they had adapted to. Soviet forces launched probing attacks across the Perekop Isthmus, testing German defenses in preparation for the major offensive everyone knew was coming. The casualty rate doubled. Feldlazarett 316, already operating far beyond capacity, was inundated with wounded faster than Metzger could process them. The surgery schedule, if it could be called that, became a continuous operation punctuated only by brief periods when Metzger physically collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping upright in a chair for 20 minutes before forcing himself awake to continue. The orderlies rotated in 3-week cycles. That was the maximum amount of time a man could assist with unanesthetized amputations before psychological damage became permanent. They would arrive, usually soldiers recovering from light wounds who were assigned to medical service before returning to combat duty, and for the first few days they would function normally. By the end of the first week, they stopped talking except when necessary. By the end of the second week, they developed tremors and startled responses. By the end of the third week, they were barely functional, moving like automatons, faces blank, souls somewhere else. Then they would be rotated out, sent back to frontline units where combat seemed peaceful compared to the surgery tent, and new orderlies would arrive to begin their own descent. Metzger didn't rotate. There was nobody to replace him. He was the only surgeon left in Feldlazarett 316, the only surgeon for 30 kilometers in any direction. If he stopped, men died. Simple equation. Brutal clarity. So he didn't stop. The physical toll became visible first. Metzger had been a solid 92 kilograms when he arrived in Crimea, fit enough for a 40-year-old academic. By March, he was down to 83 kilograms, living on the same reduced rations as everyone else, burning calories faster than he consumed them. His hands, which had been steady enough to perform microsurgery, developed a fine tremor that never completely went away. He noticed it first when trying to thread sutures, the needle wavering slightly, requiring extra concentration to control. By April, the tremor was visible, even when his hands were at rest, a constant shaking that made him look like he had palsy. The psychological toll was harder to measure but more profound. Metzger had always been methodical, organized, the kind of surgeon who maintained detailed records and followed procedures precisely. The war had beaten that out of him, replaced it with something harder and more efficient. He stopped seeing patients as people, began seeing them as collections of anatomical structures that required specific interventions. The screaming became background noise that his brain filtered out. The faces became interchangeable. The names stopped mattering entirely. What mattered was the limb, the cutting line, the blood vessels, the bone, the stump, the next patient. He was becoming a machine, and some part of him recognized this transformation and was horrified by it. But that part was getting smaller and quieter every day, drowned out by the necessity of simply continuing. The logbook, which he maintained with obsessive precision because it was the last thread connecting him to the rational world of medical science, told the story in numbers that seemed impossible even to him. January 1944, 1,847 amputations. February, 2,103 amputations. March, 2,456 amputations. April, when the Soviet offensive began in earnest, the numbers exploded. The Crimean offensive launched on April 8, 1944, with a massive Soviet artillery barrage that made previous bombardments look like training exercises. The Red Army's 4th Ukrainian Front, over 470,000 soldiers supported by 6,000 artillery pieces, 559 tanks, and 1,250 aircraft attacked German defensive positions that were undermanned, undersupplied, and overwhelmed within hours. The German 17th Army, isolated on the peninsula with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement, fought with the desperation of men who understood they were dead, whether they surrendered or fought, so they might as well fight. The casualties were catastrophic on both sides. Soviet forces used massed artillery and infantry assaults that simply overwhelmed German defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers, accepting massive casualties as the necessary price of victory. German forces, outnumbered 5-1 in some sectors, held positions until they were annihilated, then fell back to the next defensive line and did it again. The wounded flooded into Feldlazarett 316 in numbers that exceeded anything Metzger had experienced. On April 10th, 2 days after the offensive began, he performed 127 amputations in a 24-hour period. That translated to one amputation every 11 minutes, continuously, for an entire day and night. The procedure became so streamlined it resembled factory work, assembly line butchery, where the product was survival, and the waste was discarded limbs piling up faster than they could be burned. April 12th, 143 amputations. April 15th, 139 amputations. April 19th, 152 amputations. The days blurred together into a continuous nightmare of screaming and blood and sawing through bones. Metzger stopped sleeping entirely, functioning on adrenaline and coffee made from roasted grain because there was no actual coffee, and something else, some reserve of will that he didn't know he possessed. He would work until he collapsed, sometimes falling asleep standing up, catching himself before he fell, forcing his eyes open and continuing. The orderlies couldn't keep up. They were rotating through now in 2-week cycles instead of 3, breaking down faster under the accelerated tempo. Metzger watched them arrive fresh and functional, watched them deteriorate into trembling wrecks, watched them leave replaced by new men who would follow the same trajectory. He felt guilty about this, in a distant, theoretical way, knowing he was destroying these men psychologically, but the guilt was abstract and easily ignored because there was no alternative. The wounds evolved as the battle progressed. Early in the offensive, most casualties were artillery-related, shrapnel wounds and blast injuries from the massive Soviet bombardment. As Soviet forces broke through and fighting became close range, gunshot wounds increased, rifles and machine guns at ranges where bullets did maximum damage. When German defensive lines collapsed entirely and units retreated in disorder, frostbite cases surged again as men abandoned equipment and positions, trudging through snow without adequate clothing or rest. Metzger amputated everything, legs destroyed by artillery shells, arms shattered by rifle rounds, feet rotted by frostbite, hands mangled when grenades exploded prematurely, fingers, toes, entire limbs, anything that was dead or dying or infected beyond saving. The surgical technique remained constant, but the volume was inhuman. 50, 60, 70 procedures per day, every day, without pause. On April 27th, Metzger achieved a number that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He performed 184 amputations in a single 24-hour period. 184 human beings, each one screaming as he sawed through their bones, each one strapped to a table and butchered to save their lives. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. 24 hours, 84 procedures, one amputation every 7.8 minutes. He was operating faster than should be physically possible, cutting corners he had sworn never to cut, sacrificing precision for speed, accepting that some of these men would die from complications that more careful surgery could have prevented. But careful surgery meant the next 10 men in line died waiting for treatment. The calculus of triage demanded speed over perfection, survival of the many over optimal care for the few. By the end of April, Feldlazarett 316 had effectively ceased to be a hospital and become a processing center where wounded soldiers were converted into amputees at industrial scale. The recovery tents were filled beyond capacity with men missing limbs, lying on straw mattresses if they were lucky, on the bare ground if they weren't, waiting for the infection that would kill them or the evacuation that wouldn't come. The pile of amputated limbs behind the surgery tent had become a permanent fixture, burning constantly but never getting smaller because new material arrived faster than fire could consume it. The smell was something that existed beyond normal sensory description, a combination of burning flesh and gangrene, an antiseptic and human waste that saturated everything, clothing, hair, skin, until Metzger couldn't remember what clean air smelled like. Other medical personnel who arrived on temporary assignment to help, usually for a single day before being pulled elsewhere, would vomit when they entered the compound. Metzger no longer noticed. His olfactory system had adapted by simply shutting down, a mercy his other senses hadn't been granted. May brought the final collapse. Soviet forces broke through the last German defensive lines and began the final push toward Sevastopol, the last German-held port from which evacuation might be possible. The retreat became a rout, organized units dissolving into streams of refugees fleeing toward the coast with Soviet forces in pursuit. Feldlazarett 316, positioned directly in the path of the Soviet advance, became trapped between two choices: evacuate and abandon the wounded who couldn't be moved, or stay and be captured along with the patients. Metzger never consciously made the decision to stay. He simply continued working, because there were still wounded arriving, still amputations that needed to be performed, still lives that could be saved if he just kept sawing through bones. The sound of Soviet artillery grew closer daily, shells impacting near enough that the surgery tent shook. But Metzger's hands remained steady on the saw, or as steady as the tremor allowed. On May 9, 1944, Soviet forces overran the hospital's position. A reconnaissance element from the Soviet 51st Army's advance guard, expecting to find a defended position, instead found a field hospital still operating despite being on the front lines. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, unsure what to make of German medical personnel who hadn't evacuated or destroyed their facility. What they found in the surgery tent would be recorded in multiple Soviet after-action reports, each one expressing disbelief at the scene. Hans Metzger, barely recognizable as human, was at the operating table. He had been working continuously for 39 hours since the last orderly had collapsed and been unable to continue. He was alone, no assistance, no restraints on the patient because there was no one to hold them. The patient, a German Obergefreiter whose name Metzger no longer recorded, was semi-conscious from vodka and shock, his right leg half amputated, bone partially sawed through. Metzger himself was unconscious, collapsed forward over the patient, the surgical saw still gripped in his right hand, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion that had been accumulating for months. The Soviet soldiers, hardened combat veterans, who had seen every horror the Eastern Front could produce, stood in shocked silence. One of them, a junior lieutenant named Dmitry Volkov, who would later become a physician himself inspired by what he witnessed, stepped forward and carefully extracted the saw from Metzger's grip. The fingers were locked in place, muscles contracted into a grip so tight they had to be pried open individually. When Soviet medical personnel arrived 20 minutes later, they completed the amputation Metzger had started, saving the patient's life. Then they turned their attention to Metzger himself, checking vital signs, assessing him like a patient because that's what he had become. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion bordering on death. His weight had dropped to 62 kilograms, 30 kilograms less than when he arrived in Crimea 5 months earlier. His hands exhibited permanent tremor, consistent with neurological damage from sustained stress. His psychological state was described in Soviet medical reports as dissociative, present but not responsive, eyes open but seeing something other than the present moment. They moved him to a Soviet military hospital in the rear areas, where for the first time in 11 months, Hans Metzger slept for more than 20 minutes at a time. He slept for 47 hours straight, waking briefly to consume food without tasting it, then sleeping again. When he finally returned to full consciousness on May 12th, the war in Crimea was over. The German 17th Army had been destroyed or captured, 57,000 men killed or missing, another 40,000 wounded. Among the captured documents were the logbooks from Feldlazarett 316, meticulous records maintained even through the final apocalyptic month, German organizational precision surviving when everything else collapsed. The Soviet medical officers who reviewed those logs initially dismissed them as impossible, numbers so large they had to be errors or exaggerations. 23,186 amputations, performed by a single surgeon over 11 months from November 1943 to May 1944. An average of 70 amputations per day, every day for 331 consecutive days. Peak days of over 180 procedures. Success rate of 71% survival beyond 2 weeks post-surgery, an extraordinary number given the conditions. The numbers were eventually verified through multiple sources, cross-referenced with unit casualty reports, evacuation records, and interviews with surviving orderlies and patients. They were real, impossible but real. Hans Metzger had performed 23,186 amputations in 11 months, becoming a machine that converted wounded soldiers into survivors at a rate that should have been physically impossible, but somehow wasn't. The Soviet doctors who treated him in captivity were awed and horrified in equal measure. They interviewed him extensively, documenting his techniques, trying to understand how a single surgeon could maintain such a tempo. Metzger answered their questions mechanically, describing procedures in flat clinical language that contained no emotion. He could recall every detail of the surgical technique, the optimal cutting angles, the blood vessel ligation sequence, the time-saving modifications he had developed, but he couldn't remember faces, couldn't recall names, couldn't summon any emotional connection to the 23,186 human beings whose limbs he had removed. That part of his psyche had been cauterized as thoroughly as the stumps he had created. The medical board evaluation completed in July 1944 concluded that Hans Metzger was unfit for further military medical service due to psychological damage consistent with extreme sustained trauma exposure. He was transferred to a Soviet POW camp for medical officers, where he spent the next 5 years, repatriated to Germany in 1949 as part of the final prisoner releases. He returned to a country that no longer existed, the Third Reich having been destroyed and divided. He found that his wife had remarried, believing him dead. His children didn't recognize him. The university position he had once dreamed of was impossible, his wartime service making him suspect in both East and West Germany. He eventually found work as a general practitioner in a small Bavarian village, treating everyday ailments, prescriptions for colds, and vaccines for children. He never performed surgery again. Couldn't. His hands shook too badly, the tremor that had started in Crimea never fading, making fine motor control impossible. Patients who knew his history asked him about the war, about Crimea, about the amputations. He would answer factually, numbers and procedures, but nothing personal. The human part of Hans Metzger, the part that felt and connected and cared, had been amputated somewhere in that surgery tent, cut away as cleanly as the limbs he had removed. He lived until 1983, dying at age 80 from a stroke. His obituary mentioned his service as a Wehrmacht physician, noting he had been captured in Crimea, but providing no details. The 23,186 amputations weren't mentioned, that particular piece of history being too large and too terrible for a small-town newspaper. But medical historians knew. The case study of Feldlazarett 316 became required reading in Soviet and later Russian military medical schools as an example of the absolute limits of human performance under crisis conditions. The logbooks, preserved in Soviet archives and eventually declassified, were studied by military surgeons trying to understand battlefield trauma care. Metzger's techniques, developed through desperate necessity, influenced protocols for mass casualty situations where resources were limited and survival depended on speed. The ethical questions were endless and unresolvable. Should Metzger have refused to continue when conditions became inhumane? When anesthesia was unavailable? When the psychological cost to patients and staff exceeded any reasonable standard? Should he have evacuated earlier, saving himself and his orderlies at the cost of abandoning patients? Should he have performed fewer surgeries but done them more carefully, accepting that more men would die untreated, but the ones he did treat would have better outcomes? There were no good answers. Every choice led to death. The only variable was whose death and how many. Metzger had chosen to maximize the number of survivors, accepting brutality as the necessary cost. The patients he saved, or the ones who survived both the amputation and the subsequent infections and evacuations and POW camps, had their own complicated relationship with what had been done to them. Some were grateful, understanding that Metzger had saved their lives even as he took their limbs. Others were bitter, feeling they would have preferred death to the agony of conscious amputation and the lifetime of disability that followed. Most were simply confused, unable to process the experience, knowing intellectually that the screaming nightmare they endured had been necessary, but unable to reconcile that with the trauma that never faded. In 9/11, a reunion was organized for survivors of the 17th Army's defense of Crimea. 63 men who had been treated at Feldlazarett 316 attended, all of them amputees, all of them carrying visible reminders of what Hans Metzger had done to them. They invited him to attend, wanting to thank him or confront him or simply see him again, needing some kind of closure. Metzger declined. He sent a brief letter that was read aloud at the reunion, a letter that was subsequently preserved in the German Federal Archives as a historical document. The letter read, "I remember the numbers but not the faces. I remember the procedures but not the people. I did what was necessary to maximize survival. The cost was measured in limbs and sanity, yours and mine. I do not ask forgiveness because what I did was unforgivable. I do not offer apologies because I had no alternative. I performed 23,186 amputations in 11 months. 71% of you survived. That is all I have to offer. That is all I am, Hans Metzger." The letter was received in silence. Some of the attendees wept. Others nodded in understanding. A few walked out, unable to hear even that much. But they all understood, in the way that only people who have endured something truly terrible can understand, that Hans Metzger was as much a casualty of Feldlazarett 316 as any of them, his wounds just invisible and permanent. The medical legacy of those 11 months in Crimea influenced battlefield medicine for generations. The protocols Metzger developed for rapid amputation without anesthesia became part of Soviet military medical doctrine, later adopted by other nations preparing for scenarios where supply lines might be cut and field and hospitals might have to operate without modern resources. The emphasis on speed over perfection in mass casualty situations, the triage systems that prioritize salvageable cases, the psychological support systems for medical personnel exposed to extreme trauma, all of these were refined based on lessons learned from Feldlazarett 316. The numbers themselves became a benchmark. 23,186 amputations in 3,081 days, 70 procedures per day on average, peak days exceeding 180. No other surgeon in recorded military history has approached those figures. The closest comparisons come from the American Civil War, where surgeons like Dr. Hunter McGuire performed thousands of amputations over the course of 4 years, but never at the sustained intensity Metzger achieved. The difference was the industrial scale of World War II, the concentration of casualties, the breakdown of supply lines, and the presence of one surgeon who simply refused to stop. Hans Metzger's final years were quiet, spent in a small house on the outskirts of a village whose name isn't important, treating colds and setting broken bones and writing prescriptions for elderly patients with arthritis. He gardened, growing vegetables with hands that shook too badly for surgery, but could still dig in soil. He read medical journals but never published anything himself. He avoided other doctors, declined invitations to speak at medical conferences, refused interviews with historians. He wanted to be forgotten, but history wouldn't allow it. When he died in 1983, his estate included the surgical instruments he had used in Crimea, carefully preserved despite never being used again. The scalpels, forceps, bone saws, all of them worn from use, some of them still bearing microscopic traces of blood that had stained them 40 years earlier. The instruments were donated to a medical museum in Munich, where they remain on display with a placard that reads, "Surgical instruments used by Wehrmacht surgeon Hans Metzger, Feldlazarett 316, Crimea, 1943 to 1944 war. 23,186 documented amputations, 71% survival rate. These instruments represent both the highest achievement and deepest horror of battlefield of medicine." Museum visitors, medical students mostly, stand before the display in silence. The instruments look ordinary, just steel and wood, no different from thousands of other surgical tools. But the numbers engraved on the placard carry weight that transforms them into relics of something beyond normal comprehension. Students taking courses in medical ethics study Metzger's case as an extreme example of the trolley problem applied to medicine. Do you perform brutal procedures without anesthesia, saving 71% but traumatizing 100%? Or do you refuse to operate under inhumane conditions, maintaining your ethical standards while patients die untreated? There is no correct answer, only choices with terrible consequences. The Soviet officers who first discovered Metzger unconscious at his operating table later testified about what they witnessed. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent. A man who had been consumed by his duty, who had continued operating past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped, who had worked himself literally to death, except death had the courtesy to wait until after he collapsed. They spoke of the pile of amputated limbs, still burning when they arrived, smoke rising into the Crimean sky like a permanent marker of suffering. They spoke of the recovery tents filled with amputees, hundreds of them, some healing, some dying, all of them bearing witness to what had been done to save them. And they spoke of Metzger himself, 62 kilograms of barely living determination, a man reduced to a single function performed with absolute commitment until his body simply refused to continue. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, who completed Metzger's final amputation and later became a prominent Soviet military surgeon, wrote extensively about the experience. His memoir, published in 1967, included a chapter titled The German Surgeon that was required reading in Soviet medical academies. Volkov wrote, "I have seen many things in this war that tested my faith in humanity, but I never saw anything that disturbed me as deeply as what I found in that surgery tent. Not because it was cruel, though it was. Not because it was hopeless, though it nearly was, but because it represented the absolute limit of what a human being can force themselves to do when duty demands it. Hans Metzger destroyed himself, saving others. He amputated his own humanity to preserve their lives. And I cannot determine whether that was heroism, or tragedy, or simply madness, because perhaps at that scale they are indistinguishable." The question of Metzger's mental state during those 11 months has been debated extensively. Was he experiencing a prolonged dissociative episode, his mind protecting itself from trauma by disconnecting emotional processing from motor function? Was he exhibiting symptoms of what would later be called moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when forced to violate deeply held ethical beliefs? Or was he simply so completely exhausted that higher brain functions shut down, leaving only the trained motor patterns of surgical procedure running on autonomic loops? Medical psychologists who have studied his case posthumously, based on Soviet psychiatric evaluations and his own sparse writings, generally conclude that Metzger experienced all of these simultaneously. He was dissociating, injured morally, and exhausted to the point of cognitive impairment, but he was also making conscious choices to continue, overriding his body's shutdown attempts through sheer will. The human capacity for sustained performance under stress is higher than normally believed, but it exacts costs that may not be survivable. The 23,186 patients whose limbs Metzger removed scattered across the globe after the war. Some remained in Soviet POW camps for years. Others were repatriated to Germany and struggled to rebuild lives in a destroyed nation. A few emigrated, seeking fresh starts in countries that hadn't been bombed to rubble. Their children and grandchildren carry forward the genetic legacy of men who survived when they should have died because one surgeon refused to stop cutting. If you could trace the descendants of those 23,186 amputations, you would find thousands of people whose existence depends on what Hans Metzger did in that surgery tent. They live in Germany, Russia, Romania, America, dozens of countries. They are teachers and engineers and artists and criminals and saints and everything in between. They exist because their grandfather or great-grandfather survived an amputation performed without anesthesia in a field hospital in Crimea by a surgeon who was simultaneously saving and destroying everyone he touched. This is the echo that ripples forward from extreme actions, not glory or honor or medals, but simple existence. The downstream consequences of survival are measured in lives that continue, choices that are made, children that are born, futures that unfold. Hans Metzger gave 23,186 men the chance to have a future beyond that moment on his operating table. The cost was their limbs, his sanity, and the suffering of everyone involved. Whether that trade was worthwhile is a question each survivor had to answer for themselves. History's verdict is more measured. Metzger is remembered not as a hero or a monster, but as a testament to the extremes human beings can reach when necessity demands it. His story is taught not to glorify his actions, but to illustrate the impossible choices war creates, the ways that duty can consume a person entirely, the limits of human endurance when those limits are tested to destruction. In the small Bavarian village where Metzger spent his final years, there is a memorial in the church cemetery. Not for Metzger himself, he was cremated and his ashes scattered without ceremony per his will, but for the unnamed wounded of all nations, a simple stone marker placed by a veterans organization that included several of Metzger's former patients. The inscription reads, "They screamed so we could live. May we prove worthy of that price." Every year on May 9th, the anniversary of Feldlazarett 316's capture, someone leaves flowers at that marker. Usually an elderly man, one of the handful of surviving amputees still alive. Someday soon there will be no more survivors, no more men with missing limbs and memories of conscious amputation. The living testimony will fade into historical record, but the numbers will remain. 23,186 amputations, 331 consecutive days, 71% survival rate, one surgeon who worked until he collapsed. These numbers represent the absolute extremity of medical practice under war conditions, a benchmark that humanity should hope never to approach again, but probably will, because wars continue and casualties continue, and somewhere, sometime, another surgeon will face Metzger's choice: stop and preserve your humanity, or continue and save lives at the cost of everything else. Hans Metzger chose to continue. He paid for that choice with his sanity, his health, and ultimately his ability to function as a complete human being. But 16,462 men, 71% of 23,186, survived long enough to go home. They had lives, raised families, grew old. And that, in the end, is what Metzger purchased with himself. Not glory, not redemption, not even peace. Just survival for others, bought at the cost of everything he was. In the calculus of war, perhaps that is enough. Or perhaps it is simply all we have. The best that can be managed when every choice leads to horror, and the only variable is the magnitude. Hans Metzger made his choice. History records it without judgment, because the judgment is too complex for simple moral categories. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more troubling. A human being pushed beyond human limits, who continued functioning past the point where functioning should have been possible, who paid a price that cannot be calculated in numbers, even as the numbers are all we have to measure what he did. 23,186 amputations, the number that made Hans Metzger a medical legend and a psychological ruin, the number that saved thousands and destroyed one, the number that stands as testimony to what human beings can force themselves to do when duty demands it and the alternative is letting others die. That number is his monument, carved not in stone, but in the survival of men who should not have survived, who carried his sacrifice forward in the form of their own continued existence, their children, their grandchildren, the ripples of survival spreading outward through time from a surgery tent in Crimea, where a German doctor sawed through bones for 11 months without stopping until his body forced him to. The screaming, they say, could be heard for kilometers. Other units requested the hospital be relocated. The request was denied. The screaming continued, and Hans Metzger, hands trembling,